Have you ever like walked around your neighborhood and just kind of wondered how it all came to be? You know,
Yeah.
all these buildings and streets and stuff. Well, in today's deep dive, we're going to be tackling that exact question: how people build communities,
Interesting.
how they use land, and all the crazy patterns they create without even realizing it.
Yeah.
Like, seriously, it's fascinating. We're taking a close look at this document about land use and settlement patterns. And trust me, you guys are going to learn some really interesting stuff today.
I'm excited.
So to kick things off, the document starts with this like super basic definition of settlements. It says they're basically just communities where people live.
Right.
Sounds pretty simple, right?
Yeah, it does.
But then you start thinking about it and you realize community can be anything from a tiny little village to a massive city.
Exactly.
So then what makes something a town versus a city? Like, what's the difference?
That's where it gets really interesting. I mean, yeah, population's definitely a big part of it.
I would think so.
But it's not just about the numbers. It's also about like the function of the settlement. What's its purpose?
Right.
Is it a major hub for like trade and industry, or is it more focused on agriculture or something else?
I see.
And then you've got infrastructure. I mean, a big city needs a way more complex level of organization compared to, a small village. It's just a whole different ball game.
So this document actually breaks down three main types of settlements:
Okay.
towns, cities, and villages. And it goes beyond just the people, talking about how each type uses the land in different ways.
That makes sense.
It's like each one has its own unique fingerprint
Yeah,
based on what they do with the space they've got.
totally. And that's where the whole idea of land use comes in.
Okay.
The document lists out these 5 major categories:
Okay. I remember.
recreational, commercial, agricultural, transportation, and residential.
Wow, that's quite a list.
Yeah, and each one tells us something about the settlement's priorities and, its way of life.
Okay, let's break those down a bit. Starting with recreational. Um, I guess when I think about that, it's easy to picture like parks, stadiums, places where people go to have fun.
Yeah, exactly.
But what's really interesting is how this type of land actually reflects what the community values.
I see what you mean.
Like, do they have a ton of golf courses? Do they invest a bunch of money in public parks for everyone? That tells us something about them.
For sure. And think about how recreational land use has changed over time. I mean, like a century ago, a public swimming pool, that was like a really big deal.
That's true.
But now, communities might prioritize things like, I don't know, skate parks,
Oh, yeah?
mountain bike trails, or even like those virtual reality arcades. It's wild.
Yeah.
It really shows how our leisure preferences have evolved.
Next up, commercial land. The economic engine of pretty much any settlement.
Right.
This covers everything.
Yeah.
Shopping malls, office buildings, even that tiny little coffee shop on the corner. They all fall into this category.
Right. And commercial land use, this can actually be a super strong indicator of a settlement's character.
Oh, okay.
Think about it. Is it dominated by big box stores or by local boutiques?
That's a good point.
Are there massive industrial parks? Or are there more like co-working spaces for startups? The way that land gets used for commerce, it tells you a lot about the economic forces that are shaping that place.
Then we have agricultural land, keeping everyone fed.
Right, the essentials.
It's pretty vital.
Yeah.
Fields of crops, orchards, pastures for livestock.
Mm.
And it's interesting how this type of land can look totally different depending on the climate and what people actually grow there.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just geography, too. Like, agricultural practices can reflect cultural values, even historical trends.
Oh, okay.
Think about the shift towards organic farming or the whole rise of urban agriculture with rooftop gardens and things like that.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Land use is constantly adapting to all these changes.
And of course, we can't forget about transportation. The roads, railways, airports, all of that. It's like the circulatory system of a settlement, connecting everything together.
Exactly.
I mean, a settlement just can't function if people and goods can't move around.
Right, exactly. And the transportation infrastructure itself can actually shape how a settlement develops.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, think about how a town that was built around a railway line, back in the day,
Yeah.
it might develop in a totally different way than one centered on, like, a highway system.
Right.
Or think about how the whole ride-sharing thing, like Uber and Lyft,
Uh-huh.
that's changing how we think about car ownership and even parking spaces.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a constantly evolving landscape, literally.
So last but definitely not least, we have residential land. This is where people actually live and make their homes.
Right.
It's everything from houses to apartment blocks, suburban cul-de-sacs to those dense urban high-rises.
Totally. And you can learn a lot about a community just by looking at its residential patterns. Oh, really?
Yeah. Are there a lot of single-family homes? Or is it mostly multifamily dwellings?
Hmm?
Are there gated communities? Or is it more mixed-income neighborhoods? It reflects not just like individual preferences, but also social structures and economic realities. It's really interesting.
Okay, so we've talked about all the different types of settlements and how they use the land they have.
Right.
But this document, it also goes into something called settlement patterns. Basically, how these communities are arranged across the landscape.
Right.
And it mentions three main patterns:
Okay.
linear, nucleated, and dispersed.
Settlement patterns are so cool because they often reflect historical and geographical factors.
Okay.
So take linear settlements, for example. They're usually arranged along a river, a coastline, or some major transportation route, like a string of towns all along a historic trading route, for instance.
Oh, right, like the old Silk Road or even Route 66 here in the U.S.
Exactly. It's all about maximizing access to resources and transportation.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Totally. Then you've got nucleated settlements. These are the ones that cluster around a central point.
Right.
It could be a village gathered around a market square, or a city that kind of radiates outward from a central business district.
Exactly.
So, like, there's something that pulls everyone towards that center point.
Exactly. Think about how many European cities, they grew up around medieval castles or cathedrals.
Oh, wow.
Or how a natural harbor that could become a focal point for like trade and settlement. It's all about centrality and having access to what's important for that community.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then on the flip side, you've got dispersed settlements.
Right.
These are the ones spread out over a much larger area.
So I imagine that's more common in rural areas or places with a lot of farmland.
Exactly. Think about farmsteads scattered across the prairies,
Yeah.
or the sprawling suburbs that have grown up around a lot of modern cities. Dispersed settlement patterns that can be driven by things like fertile land for agriculture, the availability of cheap land, or even just like a cultural preference for having more space and privacy.
Wow. So we've gone from this basic definition of settlement to understanding how geography, history, economics, even individual preferences all play a role in how we live together.
It's pretty amazing.
It really is.
And it makes you wonder, what's next? You know, how will things like climate change,
Yeah.
technological advancements, and shifting demographics, how will those things influence the future of settlements?
That's a really good question.
Will we see entirely new patterns emerging?
It's possible.
Or will we find these innovative ways to adapt the models we already have? It's definitely something to think about as you walk around your own community.
I think you're right. It's all pretty amazing when you stop and think about it. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive.
It was great talking about this.
As always, a huge thanks to our expert for joining us and sharing their insights. Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.
Thanks for having me. I always enjoy it.